And we are live. Welcome back to the After Action Project. This is episode 112. Tonight we are joined by Matt Little of GreyBeard Actual, and we'll be discussing their Pistol Skill Development Course. If you like what we're doing and would like to help support the show, visit patreon.com/afteractionproject. If you'd like to throw us some free support and appreciation, we'd greatly appreciate a 5-star review on iTunes. After Action Project is brought to you in part by the following sponsors and supporters. To join this group of folks, send an email to jeremy@afteractionproject.com. Our first sponsor is the Locked In Grip. Have you ever lost that perfect grip after shooting multiple rounds or had your sweaty grip diminish the ability to hang onto your firearm in different weather conditions? Locked In Grip is a grip enhancer that keeps your hands free of moisture to create a slip-free connection to the action of shooting your firearm. Locked In Grip Liquid Shooting Sports Chalk is made for shooters by shooters. Visit lockedingrip.com. That's lockedingrip.com to purchase your liquid shooting sports chalk. And that's about the only thing in my range bag that I know exactly where it's at, because it comes with a nice little lanyard that I clip onto one of the straps, so I know so that I don't forget to put it on there. It's great out here in the desert heat. Or if you get or if you're a nervous Nancy like me when you're shooting in front of a bunch of folks. Our other sponsor is the Range Buddy app. It's a collection of over 160 handgun shooting drills sorted by the required target type and filterable by the skills that you want to work. There's a virtual instructor component on there that will call out random commands for you. So if you have a command target or you want to print one of the free command targets from within the app, it'll call out that random command followed by a part-time buzz. There's a firearms instructor marketplace on there full of great firearms instructors that have been vetted, that have instructor credentials beyond the NRA or the USCCA certificate mill stuff. There's a dry fire tool and tracker in there, surprise me feature, integrated leaderboard for each drill, and so on and so forth. It's available on iTunes and Android, or iOS and Android, I guess is the proper way to say that. So check it out, rangebuddy.app. It's the free version as well as some premium features in there. So enough about that. Let's get into what everybody's joining us for tonight. That's to review the Pistol Skill Development Course with Matt Little and John. Before we get into that, Matt, introduce yourself to our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us. But give us a quick 2-minute bio and rundown for our folks that might not be familiar with you.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Little, and basically the short version of this is that I joined the Army at 18, made it to Special Forces. There wasn't a whole lot going on in the Army at the time because while I was in the pipeline for SF, Mogadishu happened. So I decided to go to a National Guard Special Forces group, 20th Special Forces group, and become a big city cop. And being a young man and making my decisions with young man priorities, I looked around for the biggest, most violent city I could find and went to Chicago. The towers fell soon after I kind of got settled in there, a couple years after I got there. And then I wound up bouncing back and forth between Special Forces going to Iraq and Afghanistan with SF and with the State Department, and also being a cop in Chicago. I did a bunch of different things with Chicago, but I was on the SWAT team twice, and I wound up being the training coordinator for the SWAT team and on the supervisory staff that overran the whole team. Was still operational in that position, was still going on, all the call outs and all the warrants. And then kind of the third piece of the puzzle that I think gives me a rather unique background and kind of a perspective on shooting and how to train for shooting is that at the urging of my buddy, Frank Proctor, who was also in 20th Group, who was USPSA Grandmaster already, I started doing competition shooting. And realized very shortly how little I actually knew about being a good shooter, even though I was comfortably either the best or one of the best shooters professionally in both careers every time I went to the range. So I started doing a deep dive into competition shooting and how to train and how to make myself better, because I realized that the things I had done to that point were going to take me no further. And those three combinations of experiences, right, I think give me kind of a unique perspective on how to train for shooting and how to apply your shooting. And I wound up, the genesis of my class, and Pistol Skill Development is like the flagship class for my company, is it's very much intended to be a class that teaches you how to train yourself. Because there's only so much better you can get in 2 days of shooting, right? And technical development is different than knowing how to build your own technical skills on your own, right? So it's one thing to take 2 days and give somebody a bunch of technical critiques. It's another to say, here's how you can figure this stuff out on your own without me. And that's kind of the intent behind the class, is to teach them the things I learned the hard way about how to train and how to get better and how to figure out what technical varieties suit you the best, right? Because technique has to follow principles, but the way you optimize those principles varies a lot depending on the individual. So, and that's kind of the down and dirty of it.
Nice. Thank you for that. John, introduce yourself to our listeners. Talk a little bit about your background in the firearms world and what brought you to Matt's course.
Gladly. Thanks for this opportunity. So I would define myself in this context as a responsibly armed citizen. No background in military or law enforcement. Just currently an aspiring practical pistol shooter. I lucked out by finding Matt here in the Central Texas area. I was thinking back, when did I first lock eyes on his handsome face? And I think it was at Temple Gun Club, an evening summer steel challenge match where, you know, his physical presence is felt, coupled with his shooting. And then I honestly believe it was a former employer of his, a Texas-based firearms manufacturer, where I recognized it through a print ad. And I thought, okay, so this stud who I saw shooting at the range is affiliated with this well-known company. He's probably a pretty decent resource. So fast forward to November of 21 was when I first enrolled in Matt's Pistol Development Course. And I've taken it twice, actually. November of 21 and January of this year. So he and I have become fast friends, and he's a tremendous resource for me.
That's awesome. Before we get into the class, Matt, I want to talk a little bit. You know, you said you were the training coordinator for SWAT. How does training a group of SWAT officers and civilians, are there any correlations there, or is it night and day? And how do you think that affects or has influenced your teaching style?
So I honestly think that competition shooters train much better than the institutional training most guys in SWAT or in special operations receive. Not that that training is bad necessarily, you know, that's kind of the tip of the spear for both professions, right? So obviously they are good based upon their peers. But both professions kind of pay lip service to being tactical athletes without training their people the way coaches train athletes. And I think competition shooters look at it as an athletic endeavor, and they train like athletes train. So as far as like the application of shooting, there are some differences, right? And there's differences between military and SWAT. There's differences between SWAT and people defending themselves as civilians. But those are basically rules of engagement and operational environment considerations, right? The hard skill of shooting itself doesn't change based on whether you wear a uniform or civilian clothes or where you are in the world. You know, pulling the trigger and running the gun is the same regardless. So I think that what's been happening in the last few years is kind of this, and we're not where we need to be yet, but we're so much better off than we were even 5 years ago. Military and law enforcement has really started to embrace the value of competition shooting and training like a competitor. And I've seen the skill level come up drastically across the board in the last 5 years, without a doubt. I don't know if is that a good answer for the question, or did I kind of go off on a sidetrack there?
No, absolutely. And that's, you know, it's always interesting to talk to folks that do both. They teach military, or they train military, they train law enforcement, and then they train the civilian component. So it's interesting to get that kind of perspective on the similarities and some of the difference that might be in place. So I appreciate that. You know, looking at the course description and the prereqs, you know, you need a serviceable handgun, a couple magazines, 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Is it a 1 or 2 day class?
So a 2 day class.
2 day class. John, I want to kick it over to you. Talk to us a little bit about the gear that you ran. Was there anything specific that you brought with you to that course other than, you know, your handgun? But do talk to us about that, you know.
Sure. At the time of the first iteration, I was dedicated to the single stack division in USPSA. So I ran a 1911 chambered in 9mm with a whole waist full of magazines, which came in handy. So I personally showed up with my competition rig, which was welcomed and quite common among the cohort of classmates. There were some who had a more EDC type setup, which worked just as well. So this curriculum applies to various applications, which was well received.
Looking back, from the first class, the first time that you took it to the second time that you took it, is there anything that you wish you had brought with you, or any gear changes that you would have made for either of those courses that you took?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy, because round one was Central Texas Outdoors. Round two, we were out of state at an indoor range. So aside from what I would typically bring to a in-depth range session, we had the privilege of having some of the round two documented. So I knew there would be an opportunity to go back and revisit some material that I didn't capture personally by way of pen and paper. But I'll just encourage that type of behavior there. Whereas if you're eager to get out and actually get on the line and shoot, don't hesitate to sit back and be a student in the good old fashioned form of taking notes. So iteration one, I kind of pulled my newbie card and said, listen, I'm just going to sit and listen and soak it all in. Iteration two, there was a lot more attentiveness and note taking.
Matt, John talked a little bit about, there were some competitive shooters, some folks running EDC. Who's this course geared towards?
It honestly is about how to train with your setup, with your gun and your gear. So since it's more about training than a particular application of shooting, right? It's just a general how to train. It doesn't really matter. Like I've had people show up wearing their SWAT rigs. I've had people show up wearing, IWB holsters and everything in between. Now, the one thing I would ask is show up with a setup that displays a bit of critical thinking and common sense. I can tell you some interesting stories about students that showed up with their gear on in ways that didn't really make a lot of sense. But usually that works itself out pretty quickly once we actually start shooting and they realize how inadequate their setup actually is, and that's usually newer shooters, definitely.
When we're talking about gear, and for taking a class specifically, I try to run my courses, if I'm shooting an event or a match, I try to run it from my everyday carry setup. So AIWB, the first time I trained with Tim Herron, I took his practical performance course, and I was running my mags from Neo Mags. And so after that class, I said, okay, well, there's some practicality from running it how I carry it. However, it's not very conducive to a great learning experience. So I'm not one of these guys that wears a tactical battle belt, but I do show up, like I'll run my gun from Appendix. I run a Blue Alpha Gear double belt with the mag holsters on it, and then I run a mag pouch. But I like to have a box or two of ammo in there so I can stuff mags, because I'm a greedy student. If there's ever an opportunity for somebody to shoot more, I want to be ready to go. And that also allows me to pay attention to the instructor when they're having side conversations if a student asks a question. Is there anything that you recommend a student either bring with them to kind of improve that training experience, or, hey, probably don't show up with this?
So you actually brought up a pretty good point, right? And I don't mind if someone wants to run like a compact or subcompact gun because that's what they carry and that's their primary purpose. But what I've found for training value is that you're always better off running at least a mid-size to a full-size gun for training. You just learn more because there's less distractions, less difficulties in the shooting itself. Now, obviously, if your primary application is a compact or subcompact, then you want the same system, right? It's like if you're running like a Staccato C, then you'd want to run another 2011 that kind of operates the same way. So there's carryover. But one thing I've really noticed, especially with people that are a little less experienced, is the difficulty of running the smaller gun can interfere with their learning process. But if they run a larger gun that is related to their smaller gun, they're still getting the value from it without that added difficulty. Something I'm a big fan of is making the learning process as efficient as possible. Like I always joke in my classes that if you ever say train like you fight, I'm going to throw you out. And I actually don't, of course. People have done it back as a joke. But my reason for that is that I don't think that phrase does you actually justice. Like if you look at an athlete, there's no MMA fighter that does nothing but full contact sparring when they train. There's no football team that does nothing but put on the pads and scrimmage every practice, right? So you want to train for the fight. You want to train in the way that enables you to build your skill as efficiently as possible, and then learn how to apply it and work on applying it, right? So the one thing I would say is, and I like your idea of, having a dump pouch and a lot of ammo, because that definitely helps in my classes. My joke is that the loadout is all the bullets and all the magazines at all the times, so we can shoot all the things, right? And we really do get that 1,000 round count in. Like people need to stuff mags whenever they get a chance. So any way to do that on the line is definitely, appreciated by me for sure. But apart from that, like my only concern is that your gear doesn't interfere with the learning process, with the training process, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely it does. Hey, John, as a student, talk to us a little bit about what the first few hours of day one looks like after the range safety brief, the medical brief, all that good stuff. Once you get up to the line and you start shooting, what does the first few hours of the class look like as a student?
Yeah, I'll begin with introductions, because while it's a common practice to go around and state who you are and perhaps what you've done and your motivations for being there, what I really enjoyed about Matt's approach to that is he asks for an example of where you've applied yourself, be it professionally or via a hobby, and his ability then to not only listen and hear where each individual student has perhaps achieved success or is eager to get better in some sort of craft, but he'll hold on to that nugget and then use it throughout the 2-day course to draw parallels between, so you're a software engineer, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a skill based with your hands, right? But so for me, when it came to light that I'm a Olympic weightlifter, Matt's ability to just even change his terminology to how we're going to approach the next 2 days and then forward, really resonated with me. So the introductions, Matt does it in a way to not only shed light on who you are outside of that individual at the range, but really draws parallels to something that you know and love, to perhaps, if you're new to firearms training, a way to bridge the gap. So intros that just sets everybody off on the right foot. But there it's accuracy. He comes up and he sets the timer aside. You're given a task of freestyle, strong hand, weak hand, no time domain, and just simply wants to see where you're at, right? So even without the time domain, you can hear some paces that may not be best suited to demonstrate your ability to hold that sight picture, but that's where it begins with that accuracy test.
I like it, man. And the introduction part, that's an interesting conversation, because I've been in class and we go and you waste an hour or 2 hours or however long it is on intros, and that's it. And I'm like, nobody gives a shit what I do. I don't give a shit what anybody else does. So it's refreshing to hear that how that is actually applied throughout the course, and that Matt actually uses that to improve how he connects with the students. And I'm guilty of it too as an instructor, where I do the intro as a questionnaire in the course registration, just because on the range I'm not smart enough to retain that information and apply it throughout the course, right? So I like to have that information, that way I can digest it and look for stuff that I might need to be aware of. So Matt, talk to us a little bit about that and how you came to really incorporate that. Was it something that you were just kind of always innately aware of that would make the training experience better for the students?
No, it was more a desire to be able to give appropriate coaching cues. My first instructional experience before becoming a Green Beret, because a lot of what you do in SF actually is instruct, right? You teach foreign military personnel. But I started out teaching martial arts as a teenager. And I learned very quickly that giving the appropriate coaching cue for an individual athlete is a very difficult thing to do as an instructor, right? So part of that was just kind of a little bit of, I don't want to say selfishness, because it came out of a desire to give people the best class possible, but it made my job easier. I'm like, okay, if I know they're into this, then I have some sort of handle on how I can frame things in a way that will resonate with them to help them improve. And that was the desire behind it. The other motivation behind it, quite honestly, was I hated intros. I hated them. When I was in the military, when I was in the police department, I hated them as an instructor. I hated them as a student because I felt they were worthless. So I knew I needed to do it, but I wanted to do it in a way that actually made sense and had a purpose and did something for the class. I joke about it in the class. I talk about how when I was a student, I used to just be obnoxious about it. I would be like, yeah, my name is Matt Little. I enjoy long moonlit infills in the desert mountains and picking up heavy things and putting them back down. That doesn't help the instructor at all. That doesn't tell them anything. You know what I mean? And I always hated, especially in the military, this was always bad in the peacetime army, right? Instructor intros would become 5 minutes of "Ain't I great" from the instructor. And I'm like, well, that's really cool and all, but what can you teach me? Because the class is about passing things on to me, not about all the stuff that was cool that you did 10 years ago, right? So even in my intro, I designed it to be more about where the class comes from and why I came up with the class and my intent behind the class. And as much as I give my background, it's really just to let people understand what informs the class. It's not about, it's not 5 minutes of war stories, if that makes sense.
I can tell you, man, as I went on that 30-second rant, I was like, man, how just kind of contrasting the two perspectives, whereas mine, where it's intros are a waste of my time, and then hearing you talk about how you kind of came from that same perspective and you wanted to flip it around. And I'm like, oh man, I'm a lazy piece of crap, because that's the insightful part of that is like, well, this is something that we need to do. How do I make it useful? And then to be able to retain that information and use it through the 2 days of class. And one of the things that I found is, as a student and as an instructor, is if you can't make a connection with the student, it makes the learning process exponentially harder and more difficult. And if you can connect with a student and say it in the way that works for their brain to understand and process, you kind of look like a genius.
Yeah.
So I think I got some work to do in figuring out and being able to work the intros back into the class, because I think it's leaving a lot on the table, where if I can make a connection or have an idea on how to relate a topic to a student in a more efficient manner, it will reduce their learning curve. So the next part of what John talked about that I want to kind of dive into is the accuracy component of it. And I've been on here and I've talked about instructors not having accuracy standards and how that's a load of crap, because how do you know if you're making your students better if you don't hold them to an accuracy standard? So talk to us a little bit about like the accuracy standards that you're holding students to, and why you think that's an important part of the class.
So one of the things that I think is really important, and I think it's not done well enough in most people's training, is to really delineate what your hits on target are categorized as, right? And I use 3 categories for this. I have optimal, acceptable, and unacceptable. And in the context of the class, I talk about how you change that variable based on the training effect you want from the drill, right? It's like you can take a bill drill and change the tenor of the drill based on the training effect you want by changing the accuracy standard in the drill and not changing the time standard, right? Or allowing the time standard to adapt a bit, but still imposing a much higher accuracy standard or a lower one. A 5-yard bill drill where the entire silhouette is acceptable is a very different drill than a 25-yard bill drill where you have the top half of the A zone. right? They're two very different things, even though they're both 6 shots from the holster. The accuracy standard that John is talking about is really an evaluation I do as the first drill of the class. And it's a drill that I came up with for the Chicago SWAT team. And the drill's called Number of the Beast, because our Glocks on the team held 18 rounds, which is 6, 6, and 6, right? So Number of the Beast, because you shoot 3 strings. You shoot 1 string freestyle, you shoot 1 string strong hand only, and 1 string support hand or weak hand only, whichever verbiage you want to use. The original drill was at 25 yards, and I gave them the top half of the A zone. So when I started teaching, I got tired of walking 25 yards back and forth with the students for the first drill in class. So I changed it to a 3-inch circle. This is a sticker I put on the target at 10 yards, which actually, if you do the math, is harder. It's more difficult, right? It's just easier to see your hits or your misses. So the reason I put this in first is I want to see people's foundational fundamentals, right? Like, how well can you simply put rounds on the target when I take every distractor, every additional layer of difficulty away? How good can you be at pure accuracy? Because everything else depends on that. Speed matters. I mean, trust me, do not get me wrong. Speed matters a lot. But I've only ever met one person who could shoot fast and accurately, who couldn't also shoot incredibly accurately when I gave them all the time in the world, right? A buddy of mine, his name is Eric Camps, and he's an amazing shooter. I mess with him and call him the accidental GM, because you'd understand, like, great guy and phenomenal shooter, but he literally can't shoot a group to save his life by GM standards. Like, he'll shoot a great group by normal human being standards, but for the level of his shooting at speed, you'd think he'd be able to just be stacking rounds on top of each other, and that's just not the case. But it's Eric. So I love that guy. But my idea is that I don't even want to put a time constraint on the students yet until I see what their either weaknesses, deficiencies, or strengths are at pure marksmanship. And I also want to open their eyes to the fact that, yeah, the fast stuff is fun and it's sexy and it looks great on IG. And you shouldn't do a huge amount, I don't think, of the pure accuracy stuff. Like, I'm not a B8 snob, right? But if you can't do that, you have fundamental issues with your technique that need to be addressed. And that's just the bottom line. You should be able to shoot very accurately if I give you all the time in the world.
That makes sense. John, I want to talk to us a little bit about the most challenging part of the class for you.
Let's see. That deserves a sigh, because it's grueling in a very positive way. Grueling in that, as Matt mentioned, you are certainly going to achieve that published round count. So physically demanding. Grueling in that Matt delivers information in a real concise but concentrated manner. So it's almost as if you have to absorb what he said, digest it, and apply it. And then emotionally, right? Because the highs and lows of just being out on the range, you'll have a string where you're feeling like an ace, and another where it's just a big slice of humble pie, right? So, the most challenging was just, quite honestly, managing your physical and emotional levels throughout the 2-day course, right? And depending on where Matt teaches and the elements, in terms of staying hydrated, well fed, et cetera, I remember this, and I'll keep this PG, but the 2 nights before I was going to go and take Matt's class for the first time, an old flame shows up out of town and invites me for an evening on the Riverwalk in San Antonio. And I told her, I said, listen, I'm going to prioritize my rest because I have this exciting weekend coming up. And she still gives me hell to this day about not reconnecting. But I'm glad I did, because I needed my rest, and it was energy well spent. So again, it's approach it as you would. I love the analogy Matt uses. We're training as athletes to be athletes. So come prepared physically. And I know there's some language within the course description about perhaps there's not a standard in terms of, 10 burpees in 10 seconds, but just know that buckle up, because it's going to be a very physically demanding course.
As a student, did you observe or recognize maybe it was a drill or a couple drills that your peers kind of found challenging or difficult to overcome or complete?
Yeah, I'll point towards the classic 3-4-5 drill, where it's Matt's version of earning a challenge coin, or in this case, a patch, where it is the culmination of all that he hopes to have his students achieve. And he mentioned the 3-inch circle, and that's another really cool element about how Matt weaves in something early on that shows up repeatedly. And so those 3-inch circles are what used to demonstrate your ability to either pass or not pass the 3-4-5 drill. So, and we are giving 2 chances each at the end of day 1 and day 2. So, Matt, I'm trying to think. You were close to handing out a patch in both instances. While there were some students that were very close, I think we all came up just a bit short. So that was the crown jewel, if you will, Jeremy. And I hate to pinpoint that as an example of a drill where we didn't quite make the mark. But aside from that, the second example I'll give is Calvin ball. And I don't want to steal Matt's thunder. It's a great story behind this drill, but think of it as a game of horse with a pistol on a flat range. And so I definitely want Matt to spend some time describing this, but as you progress through this drill, the amount of mental capacity that's required to keep up with what's the task at hand. It starts out very simple, single position, single task, and then it builds. You start to see smoke come out of people's ears, and the degradation of physical skill as a result is just, it's quite honestly, it's fascinating to see how task stacking comes into play. And that's a term that I learned from Matt and use it religiously now. So Calvin ball would be the second example.
Matt, can you expand on that a little bit, the Calvin ball and the 3-45 drill?
No, absolutely. I'll start out with Calvin ball because I got to give props to the guy that invented it, right? So when I started shooting USPSA, I connected with a guy named Les Kismartoni, who is now an IDPA national champion. He's been top 20 USPSA Grandmaster at Nationals. Really, really good shooter, very, very smart guy. He was my training partner for my first couple of years in USPSA. So he invented this drill as a way to do match preparation, right? To get ready for on-demand performance with a random task you wouldn't be aware of ahead of time, because you're really not aware of what the stage is going to be like until you start walking it when you get to the match, And this drill both is a phenomenal tool for that, and it led to part of my philosophy on categorizing drills. Now, Les didn't categorize it this way, but this drill led me to create like my concept of what I call combination drills. And basically the idea is that you have experimentation drills, which are where you figure out what your technique is going to be by changing the variables like a scientist would and seeing the results. You have isolation drills, which is what people normally think of when they think of shooting. That's things like Bill drills and Blake drills and 4 aces, where you're standing and delivering, or you have movement, but it's a relatively simple drill. And you're honing in on one aspect of your shooting and trying to just build that one thing better and better, right? And everybody does that when they shoot. But what most people don't do, especially in military and law enforcement and in like the more tactical side of civilian training, is they don't work skills in combination. And what happens is that when you combine tasks together, the more tasks you stack together, the lower your performance gets on each subordinate task, and the more prone you are to making a mistake. It's just human nature. It's the way the brain works. But the good news is, while you can never totally eliminate that degradation, you can lower that gap and make it smaller and smaller over time. And that's what the best shooters have done. If you look at guys like my buddy Les or Eric Graffel or JJ Ricazza, and you look at how they train, They do a bunch of things for short amounts of repetition that are relatively complex. They don't do a lot of isolation work anymore because they don't need to. They've already gotten the juice out of that squeeze, right? But if you care about shooting, whether you're a competitor or not, look at what Eric Graffel does in his training. Go on IG, go on YouTube and watch the videos. It's a bunch of very complex series of tasks done for between 1 to 5 repetitions each, and that's it. And that's how he gets better at doing whatever is given him on demand and making less mistakes than everybody else in the world, right? So running Calvin Ball and trying to figure out why it had the benefits it did was what led me to realizing the differentiation between training things in combination and training them in isolation. And what I've seen a lot in like special forces and on SWAT teams and that is that guys can burn it down in isolation. But then when they get tested with like a run and gun course, you know, something that's more like what you do in a match, they can't perform anywhere nearly as well as they did in isolation. That's because they weren't training them in combination to develop that ability, right? I kind of liken it. I talk a lot about how everybody's got this supercomputer in their subconscious that you have to develop for shooting. And combination work is where you build more RAM for that processor. You give that processor a higher processing speed and more RAM memory so it can handle more and more complex series of tasks before it breaks down. So that's the idea there. And like I said, I got to give props to Les because he's the guy that set me down that road without a doubt. Another guy that if you care about your shooting, you should follow Les. He's Les Pepperoni on the internet. Runs a Beretta like almost nobody else in the world, and you know, shoots at an incredibly high level in USPSA from appendix, and is just an all-around good dude, very smart guy. Now, 345, you know, so for a while it was like the big marketing thing that everybody who's doing what I'm doing had to have some sort of skill award, right? You know, Scott's got his black belt patch. There's the fast coin, which I wish was, you know, in more training so I could go try to get one because I really want one of those things. You know, Gabe White's got his turbo pen, which I was lucky enough to get. You know, everybody's got their own little flavor of this, right? And I wanted to come up with something that was very well-rounded and easy to score, didn't have a lot of setup, you know, very simple target. The target you can print out actually on my website on a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, right? With all the instructions for the drill on it. So I came up with this 4-string drill, and it's only 15 shots total. If you do it right, there's 5 shots in each circle when you're done. The circles are 3 inches. There's 3 of them. There's 4 strings, and it's done at 5 yards. So that's how I came up with 345. And then I tested out that par time, and it sucked just enough for me to keep it. It made it difficult enough for me to keep that par time, but it was still doable. And I'm not gonna lie, you've got to be really switched on to get it. If you make a mistake, it's not gonna happen. I've given out 18 of them so far, 19 counting myself.
What was that part time one more time?
3.45 seconds for each string. Now, if you're shooting from concealment, I give you an extra 1/4 second on the draw. And if you're reloading from concealment, I give you an extra 1/4 second on the reload. There's 1 reload. So that would mean that if you're doing everything from concealment, your par times for 3 of the 4 strings are going to be 3.7, and it's going to be 3.95 on the other one because you get an extra 1/4 second.
Nice. What you know, we talked about, or John talked a little bit about the challenges that he saw as a student. What are some of the challenges that you see students have throughout this course?
So a lot of it has to do with, and this is a fairly common thing among people that don't compete. If you train in a vacuum, you can have kind of an inflated sense of your own ability, right? And it's not like I'm not saying people are, you know, somehow malicious or deceptive in that, you know, it's not that. It's just that if you have not been exposed to how good actually is, it's easy to think you're better than you actually are, right? So I see a lot of people who come to class and kind of have a rude awakening. And I'm always very happy when someone is able to set their ego aside and just let that go. And I see some really good improvements from the people who do. You know, and sometimes I see people come to class and they can't let go of that. They can't let go of that ego, and they start, you know, not being coachable, not listening to instruction. It's rare, thankfully, but it does sometimes happen. And that would be the biggest pitfall. I don't care what skill level someone is when they come, as long as they're safe. and understand the basics of shooting, as long as they're coachable, as long as they're open to being coached, right? Being given critique, being given correction, being given suggestions. And thankfully, that's the majority of what I see. I see very little of the other.
What are some of the challenges that you have as an instructor throughout this course?
So one would be time management, right? Because I try to fit so many things in and I try to cover as many concepts as I can, it's very easy. And like, I'll use today as a good example. Through no fault of the team I'm teaching up here in Dallas, we had a 2-hour delay on starting the class today because there were issues with the range and there was a thunderstorm and we had to shift ranges and it was a mess. Like I said, no fault of the team or anybody on the team. It's just one of those things that happens logistically, right? So because of that, I had to cram my whole first day into, 6 hours instead of 8. And it made it very, very difficult to get everything in. So even when I have the full 8 hours, if I let people go on too many side tangents or down too many detours, it's very easy for me, especially because I geek out on this stuff and I love talking about it, that I have to really watch myself or I'll burn up too much time and I'll shortchange people on something else we have to cover. So that's one of the things I have to really stay on top of myself about, for sure.
John, I want to kick it back to you. If you can think back to the first time you took this class, what was the biggest aha moment that you had? And then I guess it would be the same question for the second time that you took that class. So what were the big aha moments that you had, the big takeaways?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway the first time around was the way Matt described approaching firearms training as an athlete would in, a strength sport, where you have a specific goal, you have a competition you're working towards, and you have, let's say, an 8 to 12 week period leading up to that in which you're going to get very specific about your training regimen. And so as soon as Matt started as soon as he started to describe the approach to firearms training as if it were my weightlifting coach, a light bulb went off for me where I thought, okay, I can get as neurotic and specific as I would with a barbell as I will with my pistol. And that's just how I'm wired. So that was the biggest aha moment for me. And Matt alluded to it earlier. I mean, his ultimate goal in this 2-day course is to help us understand how to train more efficiently, right? Let's go back to that first accuracy drill, right? If he sees a pattern of low left shots for a right-handed shooter, he's going to give you a tip or two, but he's not there to refine your trigger pull technique, right? So it's just all about the application of training. So that was aha moment for me in the first time around. And earlier this year, gosh, let's see, it was my ability, Jeremy, quite honestly, to absorb a lot more of the material, right? I had a few years under my belt, skills had developed. I was running a high cap pistol with a dot, so it felt like, I was cheating compared to a single stack with iron. So, I mean, that helped, but it was just, again, I was hearing a lot of the same things for a second time, but they resonated with me a lot more. So Matt's ability to deliver information to someone less experienced, me in 21, to somebody with a few more years under my belt earlier this year. Again, it's a testament to him as an instructor that he can deliver the same information in a way that's going to resonate to anybody on the given spectrum of abilities.
Matt, it's a 2-day course, 1,000 rounds. If you could, when you're developing this course and putting the curriculum together, what's the one thing or a few things that you really want students to walk away from this class having a solid understanding of, or a skill set that they gained?
So I'm not so concerned about the individual skill set as far as their technique goes. Although I do see improvements on that during the class, and I do give coaching on that, like every chance I get, right? I want people to get individual coaching on that as well. But what I really want them to walk away from, and it's kind of the same thing I said before, I want them to walk away with an understanding of, why do I choose this drill for my training session? What drills do I need to choose to work on the things that I'm weak on right now? How do I pick the things I need to work on right now? How do I do a needs analysis and decide how good I need to be at different skills and what is my skill set I'm looking for? Because like I'll ask somebody what their goals are and I get something nebulous. I get, well, I want to be competent with my handgun. I want to be able to defend myself. I want to be, I want to move from B class to A class in USPSA. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you need to do that? And I want them to have a sound understanding of that and then be able to make a roadmap for themselves on how to get there. One of the things I say all the time in class is that we've all been to range sessions, if you've trained with a bunch of people, where it's like somebody took a bunch of drills that are fun and cool and kind of just put them together with no overarching intent, right? And no real explanation of what you're trying to get from each drill. Like, what is the training effect I'm trying to elicit, and why does this drill help me with that? And I want them to understand why to pick and choose what we do at different points in our training, and understand how to change the variables to get a different response too. Like you can use a bill drill for a variety of things based on how you approach it. And I want them to kind of have that ability to make those decisions for themselves.
And I love that. I just took a little note because, in the Range Buddy app, it's a collection of drills and you can filter them by the skills that you work and all that good stuff. But I think one of the things that it's kind of missing in the drill descriptions that I think would be beneficial to some folks is adding something in there for the drills that talked about the purpose or the intent and what you should expect to see after running that drill. So it's not just, it's kind of where the Range Buddy app came from. I'd find myself on the range and I'd be like, I don't know what drill to run. I want to work on this. I don't, and then I just end up shooting bill drills or whatever the heck else and not really having any purpose or intent behind the practice session. And next thing you know, I'm a few hundred rounds later and, I'm no better off. And I love how you talked about the needs analysis, right? And I don't think that's something that is talked about enough. And it hasn't been talked about in the majority of the classes that I've been to, where it's understanding what your needs are, why you're here, and then kind of reverse engineering that to where you're currently at is kind of how it sounds. So that's pretty cool. I want to talk to John. John, I want you to talk to us a little bit about how you've applied what you learned through attending the class twice. How has it impacted your training sessions and your overall development?
Yeah, Jeremy. So the key takeaway from round one that I alluded to about just Matt's ability to apply a known approach to firearms training led me to reach out to Matt in between the first time and the second time. And I said, Matt, write me a program as if you were my weightlifting coach, right? So it was calendar year 23. I think we had 10 weeks leading up to Handgun Nationals. And I wanted Matt to dictate what I was doing, both dry fire and live fire, for those 10 weeks leading up to the match. And so while this isn't a direct product from the course or part of the course, it was a result of me taking the course because I knew Matt understood what it meant to not only be an athlete, but to have a very specific goal and the desire to train for that goal. So, I saw a huge amount of progress just based on the ability for Matt to perform that needs analysis up front and then work with me throughout. And so, again, while it wasn't a direct product of that 2-day course, Matt talks about all of these things that he now offers to students in a one-on-one capacity about, a program, right? So that was really cool because I heard it in iteration 1. I wasn't quite ready until last year when I was finally determined to have a very specific goal at Handgun Nationals. And then so in the second time around, I lucked out by attending the course with a very skilled shooter who used to be based in the Central Texas area, but moved out of state. But Matt invited him. And so he was the rabbit I was chasing all 2 days. And so I was able to apply what Matt was encouraging us to achieve through whatever skill or drill we were focused on. But I had not only Jeff was I wouldn't call him the example, because I didn't want to mimic what Jeff was doing. I wanted to actually better what Jeff was doing. But so Matt was, both a combination of the coaching cues that he was giving, as well as just the overall application of what we were focused on. That was the biggest takeaway there of just being able to at times keep up with Jeff. I wouldn't say all the time, but it was very gratifying to see that progress.
Yeah, just a good shooter too. He's solid.
It's interesting that the training regimen, and that's something that I don't think, I know personally, right? I don't, and I feel like in the way you like it. Hey, if you were training, if you had a weightlifting coach, they would prescribe. They say, hey, this is what you need to work on. You don't necessarily need me there with you every time you're in the gym, but if you follow this training regimen, you can expect to see these kind of results. So that's super cool. Kind of in that same vein, Matt, I know, so if I'm about to take a class, if I'm going to go, when I go take Gabe White's class, I'm going to run the drills chasing the turbo pin. Right. And that, I feel like that's what a lot of folks that have taken a couple classes before, what they prepare for a class in their mind, they're preparing for the class by preparing to smoke the drill that instructor is known for or runs. Outside of that, Matt, what would you recommend if you could prescribe somebody a training regimen or a practice regimen? Say they're going to take this class in 8 weeks or 10 weeks. What would you recommend they do kind of over the next 2 months to prepare for it?
That's a really good question, honestly, because I haven't really thought about my class that way because of the nature of my class. I would say, and I would kind of give the same prescription I give when I talk about how to pick what you're working on in your training cycles, right? Work on everything a little bit and work on the low-hanging fruit that you feel is going to make you better a lot. Kind of use the 80-20 rule in that respect, right? Because I think the class is pretty well-rounded on the drills we do. We do stuff at distance. We do stuff that's fast and up close. We do slow accuracy stuff. We do accuracy stuff with a very, strict speed component as well. I do some things where I allow the accuracy to get looser so I can let guys really work on the speed. We do transitions, reloads, draws, movement, all of that stuff. So it's pretty well-rounded in terms of what's in the class. So I don't know that you can really narrow it down to that. Guys could work on my 345 if they want the patch, but I did not want my class to be just training for the test. You know what I mean? I wanted it to be more well-rounded than that. And I'm not knocking anybody's class when I say that, not at all. My friends that I mentioned before that are in the industry that have standards as well, I love their classes. I love them as instructors, and, their classes are not one-dimensional. That's not what I mean, right? But I didn't want my class to be one-dimensional. So, you can work on the 345 stuff, but even there, I think people, so let's talk about, testing and combination drills for a second, right? The way to get better at the fast coin is not to shoot the fast drill 5,000 times, just like you would do it on the test day. The way to get better at it is to break down the skills in isolation and grind them out in isolation, and then do them in combination enough to be able to string them together and test yourself. So it kind of is the same thing I'm preaching as far as how your training should be anyway. So if your goal is to pass the 345 and get the patch, I still would say don't just shoot the 345 over and over again, because it's not going to get you there. You need to be able to break it down and work on the component tasks before you stack them together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd agree with you. You mentioned Scott earlier, and Andy's taking his course. I think he's taking one or two courses with Scott. And that's the thing that he said. He's like, man, it's so much more than what you think it would be. So that's awesome to hear. What's your favorite? What's the favorite part of teaching folks for you as an instructor?
You know what? I got to say, and John is a great example of this, and I've got other people that are good examples of it as well, is seeing people return and they've gotten substantially better since I trained them the first time. That is what makes me feel like I've done something good. It's really fun to see somebody level up in class, and that does happen sometimes, but that is not, it's neither the point of the class nor is it common. You know, it's not common to have that breakthrough light bulb moment, because most of this, we romanticize the breakthrough moments, but that's not real progress. Real progress is the day-to-day grinding out a little small percentage point, you know, until they stack up and add up and you've gotten 10% better, 20% better, 30, 40% better over time. That's what real training looks like. Those aha moments are rare and they're fun when they happen, but you can't base your training on getting that. It's just not realistic, you know? So I love it when I see somebody come one year and then come the next year and they're a different shooter. That's always what makes me the happiest.
I found that, you know, for me personally, it's easier to find nuggets as an instructor in how to teach. You know, at the beginning of this episode, I talked about the intro part, and I'm like, man, it's easy to overlook that part, and I've overlooked it. You know, and there were a couple other things that I've picked up along the way in the classes that I've been in, and I feel like as a student, you know, it's kind of what you were saying. The aha moments happen a few range sessions after the class if you're deliberate about working on what you were taught in that class. You know, for me, it's never been right away, but it'll usually click, and then I'll be like, that's what it was. And then it's like, okay, that's where I heard this, or that's where I first saw it. And then it finally clicks and makes sense for me. You know, John, I want to kick it back over to you as a student. You know, you've taken the class a couple times. Talk to us a little bit about what makes, you know, from the student's perspective, what makes Matt a great instructor, if we haven't already covered it in the previous part of the conversation.
Yeah, you know, so credentials aside, because they stand on their own merit. Matt's level of investment, you know, in his students, I would say rings true as somebody who gets to shoot with him often in a competitive setting. And I'll tell you what, y'all, it's like Matt's ability to teach is on par with his ability to shoot. You know, super competitive guy, so he's very economical with his words. It's just and his ability to connect with a wide range of students and skill sets is really cool. But I will say, I mean, oozes passion, gets fired up. You'll even see him when he's demoing a drill. If it doesn't quite go right, he's got this smirk on his face, like, you dummy, I should have done better. It's just, yeah, you know, there's a level of investment that I haven't seen as often as I do when I'm on the range with Matt. So just know that he's going to come and leave it all out there. You know, he needs a day to recoup, just like we probably need 3 as students. So money well spent.
You know, as an instructor, if I see a student show up to class with a certain hat on from a multi-level marketing shooting endeavor, I don't think they're in business anymore. It always gives me pause, right? Because I'm like, okay, it's not this guy's Uncle Bob that's been teaching him how to shoot his entire life. It's folks that he actually paid to teach him some of this stuff. Matt, as an instructor, you know, for me personally, I want to be the best student possible when I'm going to class, right? Because I understand that I'm making a financial investment. I'm paying somebody to teach me some things. So I understand there's a student instructor relationship there. However, I do believe that there's a great responsibility for students to be great students, being prepared, open-minded, reading the dang course description, the email, and coming to class with your stuff squared away. And what are some things that kind of are refreshing for you as an instructor that a student does in class or preparing for what makes a great student in your opinion?
Being coachable is part of it, without a doubt. Not wanting to show how much you already know, right? Have you ever heard the Zen parable about the half empty cup? You have to be able to empty your cup to be able to pour something else into it, right? The parable goes something like the guy's with his martial arts teacher and he's asking stuff, but he keeps like interjecting and like trying to prove how much he already knows. And they're having tea and the instructor just keeps pouring the tea until it starts overflowing. And the student's like, well, you're spilling the tea. And he goes, yeah, because your cup is too full. I can't put anything else in it. Right. So I do see that sometimes where guys are like so hung on to what they know. And I'm not saying they don't know things. Like they might be very good, very high level shooters. But I'm a big believer that ego is the enemy of improvement. The moment you have this attachment to how you want to appear, you're not getting any better. And it's one of the things that I really think is important. I think it's important enough to where I tell people in class that, like, I'll do a drill and I'll do it at like a good demo pace where I know I can do it all the time, right? But if I'm talking about pushing and training, I'm like, okay, I'm going to push. And we'll see if I hook it up and we'll see if I mess it up. Because they have to be able to set aside that ego, because you don't get better doing what you're already good at. You get better by breaking new ground and moving forward and allowing yourself to fail and not being worried about looking bad in front of other people. And it's a struggle. It frustrates me too sometimes. But if you're not willing to do that, you're going to limit your progress. You're only going to get so far. So that would be the big thing I would say to avoid for sure. Things that I really like when people, I like it when they take notes, because it shows that they truly are trying to get as much out of it as they can. And I know that they're really trying to get everything I can give them. I like it when people are coachable. And I like it when people, like, I laugh and joke a lot in class and I talk a lot of smack, and I encourage my students to talk smack, because I think as adults, we learn better that way, especially competitive adults, right? So I encourage that in like a friendly way. I make sure it doesn't get out of hand, but I encourage it. But that also needs to be understood that is not the purpose we're there, right? We're not there for just a feel good slap on the back session. We're there to get better and learn how to get better. So those things help the learning environment to a certain degree. And then if you take it too far, it impedes the learning environment. It makes it more difficult to learn. So you have to strike that balance, right? So like those would be some of the big things for sure.
I like it. Before we get off of here, I want to ask, it's probably the laziest question in podcasting or interviewing or whatever, but it's something that I like to ask, because I want to make sure that we give the due respect for the course. Is there anything that we should have talked about with regards to the class or otherwise that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, that's a good question. I think we've covered the broad strokes for sure. I would say just that, the class is for learning how to be better at the hard skill of shooting. So don't worry about whether or not you're a competitor, whether or not you're military, law enforcement, a civilian. The skill development piece is the same, no matter what, right? Then the application of that skill varies depending on your personal situation and professional situation. But I even think we kind of covered that. So no, I think we've had a pretty good comprehensive, like, general overview of it for sure.
I'm mute. John, what about you? Is there anything we should have touched on that we haven't touched on yet?
I'll just point out that there's a real natural progression to the level of difficulty and skills. So, in its grossest terms, think semi-static day one with a heavy dose of movement day two. So there's just a real nice natural ramp up throughout the weekend. So if anybody at any point is eager or hungry for more, just wait. It's coming, right? So that's that's what I really enjoyed about just the natural build up throughout the course of the 2 days.
Before we jump off here, I want to talk briefly about one other thing, and that's probably the most comprehensive textbook in the firearms industry. And I got to tell you, I have Mike Seeklander's book, and that was thorough and comprehensive. And your book, The Way is in Training. Talk to us a little bit about the genesis of that, and the commitment that it was to bring that to the market.
All right. So my kind of concept behind the book, and I want this to come across without ego, because it's going to be difficult for me to articulate it where it doesn't sound like I'm being pompous, and it's not my intent, right? I'm a big fan of things like Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, Machiavelli, like all this stuff that transcends pure tactical considerations and becomes more philosophical. Like, excuse me, like another example even is Brian Enos, Practical Shooting Beyond Fundamentals. It's as much about philosophy as it is about technique, but it helps you get better at the technique. I wanted to kind of write my version of that in my own humble way. And I also wanted it to be the book I wish I could give my 18-year-old self to avoid a lot of the mistakes I made. And if you notice, nothing in there, I mean, there's a bunch of drills in there, and there's how to template your training and all of that. But a lot of the stuff in there is meant to be a starting off point for your own exploration, right? For you to find your own way from there. And that was also kind of the intent behind it. I wanted to relate everything to everyday life and make it be like your starting off point for more consideration, more study, more training, more thinking. Because I really do think that as human beings, whether you're a shooter, an Olympic lifter, IT guy, an engineer, a podcaster, right? Any of those things, developing mastery of the craft really is kind of our purpose for living. Like that's the thing that gives people really satisfaction. Everything else is kind of fleeting, but the accomplishments you achieve by really devoting yourself to something, regardless of what that thing is, seem to be what really gets people like a good, strong sense of personal awareness and pride and kind of, I don't want to say enlightenment because I don't want to sound touchy-feely, but kind of that just general comfort in your own skin, if that makes sense. And I think that the lessons people can get from that resonate whether or not you're ever in the military, you're ever a cop, you're ever a competitive shooter, or even if you never shoot at all. I wanted it to be something that could apply for leadership and personal growth, regardless of your field of endeavor. So that was kind of my thought behind it. It was a very difficult undertaking. I don't know if I would have been able to finish it without having to have several major surgeries back to back and being forced to sit in bed and on the couch. Editing it was actually harder than writing it too. So, and I got a shout out to a bunch of friends that helped me with that. Les Martoni, Riley Bowman, Caleb Giddings, a bunch of other people looked at it and kind of, helped me kind of sort that out. My wife handled the grammar, thank God. Right. And that's kind of how that came to be. It's honestly probably the single thing I've done that I'm proudest of in my life. And it might have been in some ways the most difficult.
That's usually true though, right? Things that we're most proud of are the most challenging.
Well, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about, right? Like, I think that's how we get true personal satisfaction is by achieving things and working hard on things.
Absolutely. And that book's available on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble. It's a great read. I'm in the Deliberate Training group on Facebook, Memphis Beach. I think somebody asked the question like, hey, what are some must reads? And I think your book had the most shout outs on there. Yeah. So it was, it's very well received within the community, obviously. And it shows that you put a lot of time and effort into it. It's not something that you slap together, in a week between classes. So thank you so much for that. And thank you both for joining us this evening. It was great having you both on. I really do appreciate you giving up part of your evening for us and our listeners. For everybody else, thank you so much for joining on and watching us. And remember, it's your life, it's your safety and protection, it's your responsibility. Stay safe, and we'll see y'all next week.